Well, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm Benjamin Rode. I'm a senior fellow at the ISS and the editor of the Adelphi book series here. I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing the launch of our latest Adelphi book, which is Strategy and Grand Strategy, written by Professor Joshua Rovner and published today. ISS members, of course, receive a copy of the book, and all participants at this meeting will later receive by email a 20% discount code to purchase it at Routledge. And of course, it's also available for you to buy on Amazon, either in hard copy or on your Kindle. I will briefly give a few pieces of advanced praise for Professor Rovner's book. Hal Brands, the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins, says, quote, Joshua Rovner is one of the most creative strategic studies scholars of his generation. Anyone interested in the theory and practice of strategy and grand strategy should read his new book. Professor Beatrice Heuser, the head of strategy teaching at the General Staff Academy of the Bundeswehr in Germany, says Joshua Rovner provides an extremely useful and enlightening distinction between grand strategy and strategy that helps us to understand how in wars and conflicts, past and present, the absence of alignment between the two breeds disaster. And there are many more of these that I could share with you, but I think you get the picture. Already some kind of sparkling praise for the book. The first thing I want to do is obviously thank Josh himself for the book. It was a real pleasure to work with him to bring it into the world. I also want to thank, of course, the numerous teams across the Institute who've helped bring the book to where it is now. It's an editorial teams, design teams, communication, and events, and especially, most of all, to the assistant editor, Dr. Grenier Lucy Tremblay. And I also should say I want to thank Professor Francis Gavin, the director of the Kissinger Center at the Johns Hopkins University, who actually first introduced me to Josh, and without whom I wouldn't have had an opportunity to publish this excellent book. So today, Josh will first speak for around 15 minutes to introduce the book's main themes and arguments, and then we'll go to Q&A from the audience. A little bit of housekeeping. So how it works today on this Zoom webinar is ahead of the Q&A. For the online viewers, could you please type any questions or comments you might have into the chat function, which you should see below you on Zoom. And I should note that this meeting is on the record. I'll now introduce the author to you. Professor Joshua Rovner is an associate professor of international relations in the School of International Service at American University. He previously served as the John Goodwin Tower Distinguished Chair in International Politics and National Security at SMU, and as a professor of strategy and policy at the US Naval War College in Rhode Island. In 2018 to 19, he served as scholar in residence at the National Security Agency in US Cyber Command. He's the author of Fixing the Facts, National Security and the Politics of Intelligence, published in 2011, and the co-editor of Chaos and the Liberal Order, 2018, and Chaos Reconsidered, 2023. Josh, over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Ben, for the really kind introduction. Thank you also for your assistance and your help getting this book throughout. And I really do want to echo your thanks to the whole team at IISS. It's been a pleasure to work with throughout. For anybody who doesn't know, the Adelphi series has been around for a long time, and it has featured some of the real best thinkers in international affairs going back decades. So it's an honor to be part of this series. And I'll just say it was a professional joy to work with such a great team at IISS. Thanks most importantly, though, to everybody who's joining us today and spending a part of your day thinking about pretty weighty issues of strategy and grand strategy. So I'll talk a little bit about the book, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards. I want to start with a couple of puzzles, historical puzzles. The first one is from the 18th century, and the second one is a little more recent. The first puzzle has to do with France's entry in the American War of Independence, right? France joins the American War against Great Britain and fights an excellent war. French strategy is exceptional in many ways. Right? France overstretches Great Britain's navy. France coordinates its operations with the American rebels quite effectively. And French diplomacy in service of its war effort is just excellent. France wins important allies on the continent, and it keeps them on board despite the fact that they were quite reluctant So French strategy in the American war is brilliant. And yet, this doesn't help French national security. It leaves France worse off, right? The war is quite expensive. It adds an additional debt burden to France, and France doesn't have the financial tools to accommodate this burden. All of this cumulatively undermines French security and ultimately undermines the monarchy itself. French strategy is great, and the outcome is not great. That's the first puzzle. The second puzzle has to do with the American experience in Afghanistan after 9/11, right? The United States enters the war after the September 11th terrorist attacks, right? And yet it can't win quickly, right? It quickly deposes the Taliban, it quickly sends Al-Qaeda on the run, and yet it keeps fighting for many, many years. And the fight becomes increasingly frustrating to everybody involved, to political leaders, to military leaders, and to ordinary Americans who can't understand what it is we're fighting for in Afghanistan so many years after the attack itself, right? And yet the fight goes on and on and on. Why? What accounts for this strange continuity in policy, which is really, really frustrating, right? Well, this book attempts to answer these puzzles, right? And it does so by exploring two big issues, strategy and grand strategy. Strategy and grand strategy are terms that we use all the time, and very often we use them interchangeably, right? But they're different. The terms have different meanings, and the differences are important. Strategy, really briefly, is a theory of victory. Strategy tells you how to win a war. Grand strategy is a theory of security. Grand strategy tells you how to win the peace. It tells you how to maintain security and safety in a sometimes very insecure and unsafe world. Whereas strategy focuses more narrowly on the use of violence to achieve political outcomes in a fight, grand strategy is a broader concept. It tells you how to build your military forces and to use the other instruments of national power in the pursuit of durable national security. In the abstract, these things should work together, right? Strategy should support grand strategy, and grand strategy should enable really good strategy. I'll make that a little more clear. If you fight and win, that is, if you implement a good wartime strategy, you should be stronger in the aftermath. Your relative power should increase over your rivals, and the process of fighting should reveal important information about the sources of your power, right? So in principle, good strategy should enable good grand strategy. And the opposite is also true. If you have a good theory of security, that is a good grand strategy, that should help you make better decisions about how and when to fight, right? So in principle, these things ought to work together, but in practice, they often come apart, right? In practice, it's possible, and we've got a lot of examples of states who fight very well in war, but in the service of a misguided grand strategy. We also have cases of states who have a very good grand strategy, but that's undone by strategic blunders in wartime, right? Understanding why these things come apart, understanding why strategy is disaligned from grand strategy, I think should be interesting to historians, political scientists, or really anyone who has an interest in sort of big issues of war and peace, right? And the book is written for a broad audience. The book is not a political science jargon-heavy textbook. The book is written to appeal to everybody who has an interest in these important issues. And I should say, I think it's especially important for practitioners, for policymakers, and for military officers to think hard about the relationship between strategy and grand strategy. One reason why it's important is there's a big danger in mistaking one for the other, right? If you are under the illusion that strategy is the same as grand strategy, you're going to misunderstand the consequences of your wars. right? You might misinterpret victory in wartime as something that's good and essential for your long-term national security, even if it's not, right? You might overspend in wars. You might cross the so-called culminating point of victory. And you might continue to throw resources at wars, even if they're not necessarily in the national security interest. So that's a problem that can arise during a war. Another problem is that you might learn the wrong lessons afterwards, right? The memory of wartime victories might obscure the real sources of your own national security. And you might get involved in nostalgia for past military victories, even if they kind of mask your present security problems, right? So participants, I think, have a very important interest in thinking about the difference between strategy and grand strategy and not mistaking one for the other. Doing so can lead to disaster. Right? There are a few other themes in the book. I'll go through them briefly. And the way I do it in the book is I go through a series of themes and I illustrate them with case studies. And the case studies go from antiquity all the way up to the present. It covers a lot of ground in this book. But I think in covering so much ground, it shows that these are enduring issues, that this is not a book about just sort of contemporary defense policy or contemporary strategic debates, but we're getting at sort of vital issues that exist no matter what technologies are in play or no matter when or where you are looking at. So the first big theme, strategic blunders can undermine an otherwise very good grand strategy, right? You can do everything right in peacetime to make yourself as safe as you can be, and you can undo all of that good work with poor wartime decisions. As an example of this, I discussed the Peloponnesian War, the famous battle of antiquity between Athens and Sparta. And you're probably aware there's been a lot written about this war, right? Especially over the last decade. A return of interest to Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War has dominated a lot of conversations. And what in the world might we have to say that's new about this very old conflict? Well, I think that strategy and grand strategy tells us something new about this conflict, gives us a new lens on how we understand this very long ago conflict. Basically, what happened in the war is both Athens and Sparta had conceived really good grand strategies, really sensible and coherent and sustainable theories of security. Athens was a naval trading empire. Sparta was a land-based great power, right? And both of them had built military forces which suited their security needs and which supported their theories of security. Right? And then they fought, and they fought very poorly. Both sides entered the war with a set of strategic fantasies about how they thought that they would win the war. When those fantasies were revealed as such, just a few years into the fight, the rational thing to do would have been to stop fighting at that point. But they were already vested in the outcome, and it became very difficult for them to pull back. What followed was a war that went on for almost 3 decades and ruined them both. Right? This is a clear example of states with a good grand strategy which undermine their efforts through strategic mistakes in war. A second theme of the book is that strategy and grand strategy sometimes work at cross purposes. Right? And again, the War of American Independence is a good example of this. I mentioned earlier the French experience, where it had a very good strategy, but it ended up undermining its grand strategy. Well, the opposite story occurred in Great Britain. And Great Britain fought quite poorly. I mean, I don't want to offend, but its strategy left a lot to be desired. Right? Great Britain made a bunch of strategic blunders during the war, both on land and at sea, and these contributed to its rather shocking defeat. It was a strategic disaster for Great Britain. But the irony was that losing the war was the best thing that could have happened to it, because losing that war in such a shocking and decisive way forced great British leaders to reconsider the sources of their national security. And what they did was they went back to rebuilding the infrastructure that they needed for their navy. The Royal Navy became the main instrument for British imperial dominance for the next century. But that required a lot of work, a lot of infrastructure building, a lot of financial work, a lot of administrative work, right? Overseeing North America, overseeing the 13 colonies and all of those restive troublemakers was not going to help, right? So the experience of losing this war forced a conversation in London about the real sources of British strength, and those were at sea. And this was I think, the real starting point of Britain's century of grand strategic success. In the British case, unlike the French, strategic failure leads to grand strategic triumph. A third theme in the book is that uncertain grand strategies can lead to half-hearted hedging and frustrating strategies. And as an example, I focus on the US experience in the Vietnam War, especially in the peak of ground operations from 1965 to 1971. Right? The United States has been criticized for its poor effort in Vietnam, usually because critics say that it just was fighting the wrong kind of war. The common criticism of the United States is that the US Army wanted to fight a big World War II style fight against an insurgent movement, and that made little sense. I don't think that argument stands up. I think that the United States actually tried a lot of counterinsurgency tactics. The United States tried a lot of everything in this war, but it couldn't find success. I think the bigger story is that the United States was fighting in this war during a period of grand strategic flux. Right? Think about it. This is the critical time period between the Cuban Missile Crisis, on the one hand, and détente, on the other hand. Right? Early 70s détente with the Soviet Union. From the high point of Cold War tension to the lessening of that tension a decade later. And in between those two markers, you have this period of change. And American leaders aren't quite sure what their grand strategy is. They're not willing to let go of the Cold War. They're not willing to abandon this conflict with the Soviet Union, this ideological and military contest. And yet they're worried. Right? The Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin crisis were bracing affairs, and they were terrifying. So there's a sense in Washington that we want to continue fighting the Cold War, but maybe not quite the way we were before. And it's during this time that they're making the major decisions on strategy in Vietnam. Unsurprisingly, given this background, those decisions are half-hearted and hedging. Right? The Johnson administration cannot settle for a long time on a theory of victory. It tries a bit of everything. Right? It picks from a grab bag of strategic alternatives, and it's frustrated continually as a result. Right? I think that this is one way in which grand strategy affects strategy in war, but not for the best. A fourth theme in the book is that some military decisions are quite sensible in terms of strategy, even though they make little sense in terms of grand strategy. As an illustration of that, I use a couple of cases. One is the nuclear revolution, right? This argument about the effects of nuclear weapons on international politics. And really briefly, the nuclear revolution was a thesis that these weapons were too powerful to use in war, that our old ideas about strategy were out the window because you couldn't actually use nuclear weapons the way that you could use conventional weapons. They were too big. Using nuclear weapons threatened annihilation, right? So it made no sense to even think of them in the same sense that you would think about normal military forces. Well, if that thesis was true, then we should have seen a lot of peculiar behaviors in world politics. We should have seen leaders being okay with proliferation, for instance, right? Because the idea was if everybody had nuclear weapons, everybody would be sober and cautious, and we would have fewer wars. Incidentally, this argument was made most famously in an Adelphi paper by Kenneth Waltz in the early 1980s, right? The idea of nuclear weapons, more will be better. But of course, leaders didn't believe this. Leaders, especially American leaders, were always worried about proliferation, and they spent decades trying to stop it, right? In other ways, the nuclear revolution thesis seems to fail the historical test, right? So if this thesis was correct, then we should have seen leaders satisfied with small numbers of nuclear weapons. You don't need many nuclear weapons because they're so powerful. But we know that the opposite was true, right? States built enormous nuclear capabilities, especially the superpowers, right? So it seems like the nuclear revolution thesis is failing. At the same time, nobody's used these weapons since Nagasaki, right? Nobody ever used nuclear weapons since 1945. And that's really important to explain. Like, why not? Right? Leaders are happy to use all manner of other different weapons, right? Even bloodthirsty leaders and very hawkish leaders would not use nuclear weapons. They reacted very differently to them, both in the US and in the Soviet Union, I should say. So in this sense, it feels like the nuclear revolution thesis is right. Leaders don't view nuclear weapons as the same, and they won't use them the way they use other weapons in war. So how do we reconcile these two observations? Well, I think that strategy and grand strategy can help. I think that the nuclear revolution thesis fails in terms of grand strategy. It just fails the historical test, but it passes the test in terms of strategy, right? So the thesis is present in terms of the wartime use of nuclear weapons. It's true, nobody is willing to cross that fateful threshold. But in terms of grand strategy, it doesn't seem to pass that test, right? Finally, the last theme that's in the book has to do with emerging technologies, and this brings us to the present, right? There's obviously a great deal of talk of emerging technologies today, especially with regards to cyberspace operations and artificial intelligence. And I thought in writing, I should say something about these, whether or not grand strategy and strategy tells us something about these remarkable technological changes we're living through. So to do this, I look to the past, right? And I ask a question, how have people responded to similar technological revolutions in the past, both in terms of strategy and grand strategy? And it turns out there's an interesting pattern. What happens is that at the start of a new technological revolution, there's a combination of hope and fear. The optimists think that mastering these new technologies first will lead to extraordinary gains, both in terms of warfighting capabilities and national security broadly. So, for instance, the advent of the modern capital ship, starting in about the 16th century, leads early naval strategists to say, wow, if we get there first, if we master this new technology, and if we can fight on open seas, we will be invulnerable in war and secure in peacetime. This changes everything, right? At the same time, pessimists worried that if their rivals got there first, if another country develops this technology first, we'll be in deep danger, both in terms of strategy and grand strategy. We see after some period of time, however, they become resigned to the limits of new technologies. It turns out it's really hard to operate a capital ship. It turns out it's really hard to operate a navy, right? And there's all other kinds of reasons why what you can do with new technologies in theory doesn't meet up with real life, right? So there's a pattern of hope and fear and then resignation about new technologies. We see this in the naval domain. We see it in the air domain at the advent of powered flight and strategic bombers, right? And I speculate in the book about whether or not we're going to see it with cybersecurity and AI today. And indeed, I close the book with some discussion about China and the United States and the issue of emerging technologies in the context of this geopolitical rivalry, right? On the one hand, we've seen these new technologies come online, especially AI, the thing that's animating a lot of our discussions. And we are seeing a lot of hope and a lot of fear side by side, right? Whether or not we get to resignation is an open question. Whether or not leaders in Beijing and Washington start to learn the limits of these new technologies, we don't know yet, right? But I hope, for everyone's sake, that they think about those limits in advance of any possible conflict. So I'll stop there, and I really look forward to questions. And thank you again for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for that, Josh, for a typically kind of excellent overview and allowing us to get a kind of feel for some of the core questions that your book really tackles. And perhaps I should have said it earlier, but it was a real honor for us to publish your book within the series, and we're very proud to do so. And I feel it fits in very well with some of our, our distinguished previous publications throughout the decades. I should also say, perhaps, I mean, as you said, perhaps more indirectly, is the book is written in a kind of accessible manner. So though you're dealing with very difficult, tricky questions, you write about it in a very easy to read way. As the aphorism is, you make the reader think, you don't make the reader work to understand your arguments, which are delivered in sparkling prose. Now, I've got a number of questions here, and I may start off with just one of them, actually, from my colleague, Dr. Dana Allen, who is the editor of Survival. And I should also say that Dana was an internal reader of the book and provided some extremely helpful and perceptive comments. So Dana says, this is a truly brilliant book, and I enjoyed it immensely. And he asks a question which you touched on, Josh, in your remarks about the case of the Vietnam War, in which you're illustrating this kind of misalignment, I suppose, between strategy and grand strategy. You talk about US grand strategy being a period of flux. Mm-hmm. And I'm paraphrasing Dana slightly in this. You suggest that LBJ escalated the Vietnam War at the time when the grand strategy was in transition and uncertain, causing a fatal confusion about the importance of Vietnam. And this makes sense. However, Dana asks, to what extent was this a matter of circumstances, i.e. the growth of the Sino-Soviet split, offering options to Nixon and Kissinger that were not available, or at least not so visible, to LBJ a few years earlier? Moreover, you seem to argue that Nixon and Kissinger's better developed grand strategy involving triangular diplomacy enabled a more successful strategy in Vietnam. However, this success, as we call it, the successful negotiations, occurred only 2 years before Saigon fell to communist forces in 1975. Is it possible that the fall of Saigon ironically served US purposes and grand strategy, just as Britain's defeat in America brought it to a better grand strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's actually a couple of questions in there, and I'll try to get to both of them. Typically astute questions from Dana. The first one has to do with the changing context of the end of the Vietnam War. I agree utterly. The Sino-Soviet split had gone from diplomatic tension to open war by 1969, and there was a deep fissure between those. So the geopolitical options were changing for the United States. And this was the context of Nixon and Kissinger trying to exploit that change in the service of triangular diplomacy, but all in the nature of extricating the United States from Vietnam and returning to a different kind of great power diplomacy, right? My theory in the book doesn't really depend on context. I assume the geopolitical context will change and that grand strategy and strategy can change along with it. And so I give the Nixon administration credit for seeing this change and trying to take advantage of it in the way that they did, right? Now, in terms of the sort of bigger counterfactual question, like what if South Vietnam had survived, right? It's very difficult to answer this. I think that in one way, the United States clearly benefited from losing and losing painfully. right? The United States clearly had to go through a very hard learning process about what were the real sources of its national security, right? And was it really worth the investment of tens of thousands of lives and many years and a lot of national resources for a conflict which wasn't clearly related to American national security? Losing in a shocking manner was important for forcing that conversation, much as it had been for Great Britain in the American Revolution. It's always tricky dealing with counterfactuals, but it's worth asking, would the United States have been better off had it stayed in country for an indefinite number of years after 1973, right, in large numbers? Would that have been good for American national security, or would it have become an albatross? Would it have become something like Afghanistan after the early years of that conflict? I suspect the answer is yes. Right? And one of the things about studying strategy and grand strategy is a lot of the answers to these questions are quite unsettling. Right? There's no comfort in that the idea that losing can actually be better in the long term, right? And that winning a war actually can leave you in a more precarious grand strategic position later on. But again, I'll say one other thing in response to the question. What does need to happen after a traumatic wartime experience is a serious and reflective conversation of really what went wrong. And it's hard to do this. It's hard to have those conversations. The instinct in the aftermath of losing is to point fingers, is to make accusations about who was responsible and who is to blame. And yet, if you can get past that and try to have as genuine as an objective conversation about the sources of failure, the better off you will be, right? So Great Britain went through its period of parliamentary sniping, to be sure, but afterwards, it didn't last that long. Afterwards, there was actually quite serious discussion about how to strengthen the Royal Navy and how to bolster the administrative state. The United States is going through that right now, right? There's an Afghanistan War Commission, which is ongoing. From what I can tell from the outside, I think the conversations are really serious and earnest. And I think that in the long term, this will be a good thing. But it's fraught politically, to be sure.
Thank you so much for that, Josh. Sorry, I had a couple of comments from people saying they had lost audio, but luckily now that's been restored. I think that may have been an individual's issue. Our audio was fine here. I've got a flurry of questions coming in. It's always great to see super engagement from our large online audience. I will take one, but with the kind of caveat that a number of people have asked this kind of similar question, essentially asking for your views, applying your analytic prism to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I'll first take Paul Freoli's question. Paul is one of our senior fellows in our Washington, D.C. office and also editor of our Strategic Comments publication. Professor Rovner, thank you for presenting such a clear analysis on a contested topic. And Paul has read the book, and he said, near the end of the book, you argue that Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine was inconsistent with the grand strategy it had long followed up to that point. Can you please expand on this point? Was, for instance, Putin's 2021 essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians an attempt, looking ahead to the following year, 2022, to bring Russia's strategy and grand strategy into greater alignment? And as I said, I've got a number of questions from other colleagues, such as Tom McCain or Alejandro Pescador, along these lines about how do we understand what has been going on with Russia and Ukraine with strategy and grand strategy.
Yeah, it's on the one hand, thank you for the question, Paul. And it's always tricky to try to comment on sort of what's happening right now. There's limits of available information. As a scholar, I'm always a little bit nervous about trying to make firm conclusions until we have 50 years and lots of open archives and a more solid historical record for what's going on. So with that caveat in mind, I'll try to give you my best sense of Russian grand strategy and strategy. And I think doing that requires another sort of longer term analysis. My bottom line is that Russian grand strategy, up to about 2011 and certainly in 2014, made a good deal of sense. I think that Russia had a very strong hand to play, especially before the Maidan uprising and the events of 2014 and the start of the war in Donbass. What Putin had at his disposal was he was facing an adversary which was becoming tired. NATO was losing coherence. NATO was losing enthusiasm. The United States was frankly tired after many years fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, right? NATO itself was kind of not thrilled about all of this, right? And Russia was embarking in this kind of slow pressure campaign to weaken the foundations of Western European solidarity against it, right? And there was an economic element to this effort, there was an information element and a propaganda element, and all of that was slowly, cumulatively strengthening Russia's position by weakening the opposition, right? And I think that made a great deal of sense. After all, Russia had serious military problems. Its conventional forces were trying to modernize, to trying to recover after the 1990s, which were a disaster for the Russian armed forces, right? And so they didn't need to fight. They were rebuilding, they were trying to modernize their military, they still are, and provoking a pretty intense war in Ukraine in 2014 was a mistake. The invasion in 2022 is an extremely bad mistake. And here's where the strategy comes radically disaligned from Russian grand strategy. Because from my perspective, Russia was abandoning all of the things that it had going for it. It was taking its strong hand and playing its weakest card, right? By taking the risk of an armored incursion into Ukraine, right, it was basically undoing all of the good work it had done to try to weaken the bonds that were holding NATO and Europe together. And suddenly it breathes new life into the alliance. Suddenly, by waging a strategy which was so blatant and overt and indefensible, it caused Europeans to come together in a big and meaningful way, right? And as a result, support for Ukraine, both from European NATO and from the United States, has enacted a gigantic cost on Russia, right? And there's arguments about just how serious the costs are, both in military terms and in economic terms, right? I have the sense that they're really bad, right? And again, we won't know the truth of this for some time, but the casualty figures on the Russian side are staggering. Like every single day, they are absorbing huge, huge blows. And they're also having to finance this war in a way that I think is probably going to pile a huge debt burden on Russia going forward. And it's going to do no good for Russian currency either, right? So I think that in the long term, this disjuncture between Russia's prior grand strategy, this slow, patient, cumulative campaign against its adversaries, was inconsistent with the invasion itself. And that inconsistency is going to have really long-term consequences for Russian grand strategy.
Thank you very much, Josh. The questions are flooding in now, so I may have to amend my own question filtering strategy somewhat. A question from, and apologies in advance if I mispronounce anyone's name. A question from Klaus Dahlem. Can you please try to explain how you understand President Trump's recent claims about control of Greenland, Canada, and Panama, if it is indeed a part of a grand strategy?
Yeah, I suspected I would get a question like this. First thing I'll say is that I have no earthly idea, right? And this is not just me trying to cover myself. I don't know, right? Trump has not yet taken office. Um, I can only make some kind of inference for what this all means. I will say, though, that these um, uh, tweets, or whatever we're calling them now, or these threats towards Panama, towards Greenland, towards Canada, they're not totally unusual in a couple of respects, and they do kind of take me back to Trump's first term in office. One thing that is consistent is that Trump, I think, sees bluster as a bargaining tactic, right? So his general approach to grand strategy is to keep everybody off balance, right? Both to so that they're not confident about challenging the United States, maybe, or so that they will be more amenable to a better deal. Trump sees himself as a consummate deal maker, right? So if you start with a sort of outrageous claim, if you start by making outrageous threats, perhaps that puts you in a stronger bargaining position later on, right? How that benefits U.S. grand strategy, I'm not sure, right? But the second part of Trump is he does have a kind of fixation for control of territory, right? His general principle is that if something is worth fighting for, you need to acquire it and keep it, right? And you can think back on his initial approach towards sort of Iraq in his first term. He talked about taking the oil and holding the oil. So a very sort of 19th century, mercantilist perspective, imperialist in some way perspective. We need to hold this stuff for ourselves. And maybe some part of that appeals to his views towards, say, the Panama Canal. It's not good enough to make a deal with somebody for access. We need to actually hold this piece of territory in this waterway so that it can really be assured for us. Right? The last thing that might explain what's going on is, in a strange way, climate change is affecting Trump's vision of U.S. grand strategy, though he would never admit that, right? So climate change is changing the nature of polar geography because of polar ice melt, right? And there's a possibility that new Arctic waterways are opening up and that they might be an area of competition between the U.S. and Russia and China, right? So from Trump's perspective, and again, this is pure speculation, from Trump's perspective, it might be where holding on to such a large landmass in Greenland is essential. Again, it's not good enough to make deals. It's not good enough to, make some sort of deal for access, which the United States already has, right? You need something bigger and something perhaps more permanent. But again, this is pure speculation.
Thank you, Josh, and a very interesting, I suppose, kind of coverage between the various levels of explanation we could have, whether that is the geostrategic and control of strategic geography, or perhaps a more psychological level where it's psychologically pleasing to be able to paint new bits of the map the same color as your own. I had a kind of point of order from one of our participants who asked, fair enough, are you sharing a recording or notes of this discussion? And I should say, yes, not only are we on the record, but there is a recording being made of the discussion, and it should be available on our website, usually within about 48 hours of the end of the discussion. Now, I had a short but I think helpful question from Ferdous Intaj. We've got about a week left of the Biden administration, and the question is, was the Biden administration good at developing a grand strategy for Europe, Middle East, and Asia?
Oh, that's a big one.
You can give a headline version if you'd prefer.
I think that the Biden administration's grand strategy was challenged from the start because President Biden came into office both as a sort of traditional liberal internationalist. He was very much of the mainstream in American grand strategy. He believes in alliances. He believes in institutions, right? He believes in a forward presence for U.S. military forces, and he believes the United States is good for the world. And as the world is safe for democracy and safe for liberal institutions, so the United States will also be secure. These are very familiar ideas in the United States, right? The difference with Biden, however, is that he was always on the sort of dovish wing of the Democratic Party, right? Especially after the war in Iraq, right? Starting in basically in about 2004, Biden becomes very circumspect about the use of force, right? As vice president for Barack Obama, Biden was consistently trying to pump the brakes on military action, and there were much more hawkish advisors to Obama than Biden was. He consistently was saying no to proposals for doing more in the world, right? So this put him in a curious kind of bind upon taking office. On the one hand, rhetorically, he pledged to uphold the sort of traditional liberal international order, right? He's very much a champion of institutions and alliances and so forth. And you might remember when he came into office, he proclaimed America is back, right? And the old America that you used to know, we're back after the first 4 years of Trump, right? But this was in tension with his instincts against using force, right? He saw Afghanistan as a burden, and he tried to extricate U.S. forces from Afghanistan, right? He he wanted to confront Russia when it invaded Ukraine, but he immediately came out and said U.S. forces will not be involved directly in this fight. He was worried about getting involved in conflicts, both because they might escalate or the U.S. might get bogged down in them, right? This created real tension because Biden, who didn't want to have a big U.S. presence in the Middle East, right? And Biden, who worried that a bigger European commitment might draw attention away from East Asia, was stuck because the two big crises happened in Europe and the Middle East, right? So here's a way in which we might be able to understand the Biden administration's problem. From a grand strategic perspective, it wanted to uphold existing institutions and existing political orders. But from a strategic perspective, that is the decision to actually use force, well, he wasn't really keen on doing that, especially not in the Middle East, especially not against Russia in Ukraine directly, right? And this has led, I think, to a lot of frustration um, among critics of the Biden administration, right? I think the distinction between its grand strategic starting point and its strategic views tells us a lot about why people are so critical. And if I could just say one other thing along the same lines, it's also worth thinking about President Biden in terms of continuing counterterrorism operations, right? This kind of works in the other direction, right? Because counterterrorism is ongoing. It's kind of lost in the news with given all of the wars in Europe and the Middle East and Africa. But terrorist operations are ongoing, right? And what explains that? Like the United States has been fighting this sort of open-ended counterterrorism war since 9/11, and it shows no signs of stopping, right? So why is that? Strategically, it's hard to make sense of it, right? These military operations don't really make sense in terms of strategy because there's no clear definition of victory. And if strategy is a theory of victory and you can't define victory, well, then by definition, you can't have a strategy. So what in the world are we doing? And what is the Biden administration doing? I think this actually makes sense in terms of grand strategy. Here's a case in which the Biden administration's conduct is we can interpret it through the lens of grand strategy, even though it doesn't make sense in terms of strategy. I think that what's going on is that American counterterrorism is more like policing than it is like military operations in the pursuit of a political objective, right? The United States uses intelligence, uses special operations forces, uses drones, uses things which are quiet and niche capabilities to attack terrorists before they're strong enough to pose real threats, right? To try to prevent groups from becoming the next Al-Qaeda and to prevent organizations from coordinating their activities so that they could present that kind of threat. This is a grand strategy which is kind of akin to old-fashioned imperial policing. right? Even though the US doesn't have an imperial constabulary, the, the United States is involved in this kind of open-ended police work. And just as there's no endpoint for police work, you don't declare victory over a crime, you just police it, right? I think the same thing is happening with US counterterrorism and with the Biden administration's approach to the ongoing global war on terror.
Thank you, Josh, for a heroic kind of overview of an extremely broad question. Got about 10 minutes left. I want to briefly see if we can change gears slightly with an interesting question from Robert Millard. I'm fascinated by what businesses can learn from the differences between strategy and grand strategy. It seems to be that in business, strategy is about setting specific economic or structural objectives and how to achieve these. Grand strategy is about how to develop sustainable competitive advantage and market power more broadly. Do you have any thoughts about this? And I suppose what Mr. Millard is drawing is this, these are terms that are used so widely, and with your kind of quite precise analytic framework, can those interested or involved in business kind of learn anything?
I mean, I would hope so. I mean, I'm of two minds on this question because on the one hand, I think war is different, right? War is violent, and violence is different from other kinds of human competition, be it commercial competition or other kinds of political competition, right? Violence arouses really intense emotions, and it causes human beings to act differently than they do in other ways. So in the book, I try to focus on the experience of war itself. That said, it's certainly possible that you could draw analogies to other kinds of competition. So I'll just think out loud about business for a second, just thinking abstractly about a business. Suppose that I wanted to sell a certain product and I had some weird emotional attachment to this product. Maybe as a child I had dreamed it up and I had invented it and I wanted to sell it, right? My company might sell 5 or 6 other products, but this is the one I love, right? Because I've got a personal connection to it. It's my baby. So I can imagine a situation where I pour all of my resources, my marketing resources, my sales resources, and so forth, into selling this product because it means so much to me. And maybe I do. Maybe I increase sales of that product, which would be like a strategic victory, but at the expense of my broader business because all of my other products don't receive enough attention and don't receive enough distribution, right? So I win in terms of selling the product that I love the most, but my overall bottom line, my long-term business health fails, right? If I mistake selling this one widget, right, for overall business success, that's probably a mistake. And in that sense, it's akin to doing well in strategy in a war at the expense of your long-term grand strategy.
Thank you very much, Josh. Mindful of time, I'm going to ask one question related that someone has asked relating to China, and then I will close with a kind of overarching question, which might be useful to hear your views on. The first question from Thomas Tan. Could you comment about whether Xi Jinping's intimidation and provocation of the littoral countries of the South China Sea was an opportunistic strategic endeavor, but has become a tangled, unwinnable grand strategy now because it can't retreat without bringing humiliation and embarrassment to him and the state or CCP?
I'm not enough of a China specialist to answer competently. I think that to answer that, you would have to know a great deal, not only about Xi Jinping's political position, but the constraints he faces from nationalists in country. So I don't want to speak too directly to that question. There are much better China analysts, China political analysts than I am. One thing that I might say about China is that while the details of Chinese politics matter, of course they do, in a broader sense, China seems to be behaving like a lot of other maritime great powers over history. There is an impulse to expand on the water, right, to push out. And whether that's simply because Chinese leaders don't like the idea that they are in a cordon because of US military bases and US alliances, and they want to break out of it, or whether that's a first step towards a broader expansion, right? Either way, there's a reason why great powers don't like being hemmed in, right? And so I think that China's impulse to push out, to build its navy, to try to expand its infrastructure, its base infrastructure abroad, it's very consistent with other great powers historically. What worries me with China is that in the event of a conflict, if God forbid, the United States and China actually go to war, right? There's going to be very little disincentive for China to cut a deal and get out of that war, right? It would be a huge gamble, a huge risk for China to actually take on the United States in an armed conflict, right? And if it did that, one would presume that for Chinese leaders, the stakes must be enormous, right? So in such an encounter, and I write about this in the book, you have two opposite dangers. The first danger, which gets a lot of attention, is escalation. Chinese leaders fearing for the future of their government, fearing for the future of their country, might resort to nuclear use. Right? We spend a lot of time thinking about that problem. But the other danger is a long, protracted war. Right? And this would occur because the United States and China both fight, they both try to win quickly, they both realize the limits of their technological capabilities against a strong rival. They both back off a little bit, but they're unable to find a peaceful resolution. And in that case, they'll find themselves, much like the Athenians and the Spartans found themselves, stuck in a protracted war that benefits nobody, right? So in terms of grand strategy, China's impulse to expand does confront the United States' impulse to maintain the status quo. How this plays out in terms of strategy is quite worrisome.
Josh, thank you so much. And your wise answer also reminds me of a book we published about 15 months ago in this series by Dr. Iskander Raymond called Planning for Protraction on this very question. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I will ask if to quickly address a wise question from Ahmed Banama, who says, what key capacities or factors must a state cultivate to stay focused on its grand strategy and to avoid being swept away by the immediate success of short-term military gains? In other words, what should states do to heed your advice?
Fantastic question. The one thing that they should do, I mentioned earlier, is to try to the best of their ability to be honest about their past wars, right? And to find ways of doing objective, quiet, after action reviews, for lack of a better word, so that they can try at least to avoid learning the wrong lessons, right? Even if they don't get the right lessons dead on correct. Right? The other thing that they should do is engage, and I'm a big fan of professional military education, right? The kind of education which is historically taught at war colleges and at national defense universities and so forth. Not simply to train military officers to be better at war, but to think harder about the relationship between war and the peace that follows, right? And here, this kind of thinking can help a great deal. Like investing serious academic work in war colleges is important. Ideally, those places would also attract civilians. Those places would also become hubs of interaction between aspiring civilian national security professionals and military officers, right? It would improve civil-military relations, and it would improve discussions, I would hope, on the weird relationship between strategy and grand strategy. The last thing that states can do is invest in higher education, but of a particular sort, right? Invest in higher education programs that bring together scholars from different disciplines. I mentioned earlier that this book is meant to appeal to lots of different people, historians, policy analysts, political scientists, military officers, whomever, right? But having this kind of conversation is important. If you want to get the relationship between strategy and grand strategy right, you cannot have people in silos. They need to be in the same place and they need to be talking to each other. So any kind of higher education that aspires to that kind of interaction, I think is bound to help.
Thank you, Josh. I mean, I have many, many, many more questions, and it would take us a very long time to exhaust all of them, but I'm afraid we do have to stop there. We've reached the end of our hour. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us online for their stimulating and thoughtful questions. And most of all, again, I'd like to thank Josh for his fantastic work on this book. I do recommend that everyone goes out and get a copy if they don't already have it. And thank you so much again, Josh, for all of your hard work and all of your really stimulating thinking and superb writing. It's been a real delight to work with you, and we're so proud to publish you in the series. Thank you so much, and take care.
Well, thank you, Ben. And again, thank you for everybody for joining today. It's been great.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye, everyone.